business. Well, thank you, Don, and thanks for inviting me out to your meeting. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to talk, like Don said, about finishing, and I'm going to talk about pretty fundamental things of finishing. If you have questions, go ahead and ask. If you can hold your question to the end, it's better, but if you really want to ask and it's relevant at the moment, feel free. So anyway, let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about wood finishing. So why do we finish wood? You know, what do we achieve by finishing wood? And there's a couple of things that we can achieve by finishing wood. One of them is that putting a finish on a board will help to stabilize the moisture content in the board. And let me clarify what I mean by that. So the moisture content we know in wood expands and contracts, it absorbs moisture from the surrounding area and releases it when the air is dry. And that process is going to happen. There's really not much we can do to stop it. So that moisture transfer does happen, and it's going to continue to happen. But think of it this way: if you had a raw board and you poured a glass of water on it, it's going to soak up a lot of water. The moisture content is going to spike. The board might even crack. It expands so much. So by having if you had a finish on there and you poured that water on, then you're not going to affect the moisture content nearly as much. And so that's what I mean. It maybe just even out the variations in moisture, but it is still going to expand and contract. Another reason we might finish is to protect the wood, protect it from stains or abrasion. You spill some red Kool-Aid on a raw piece of maple, you're probably going to leave a stain, but if you have a finish on there, you might get away with it. But the main reason that I finish wood, and probably you too, is to beautify it. I work on my projects downstairs in my little shop, and I work on them for a week, a month, a year. And when I bring my little baby up out of the shop to show it to people, I want it to look as good as it possibly can. And the finish you put on it makes all the difference in the world as to how that piece is going to appear. So that's the main reason that I would finish wood. And you should know too, though, that there's no rule or no law that says you have to finish wood. And in some cases, you might be better off not finishing it. Think of maybe outdoor furniture. If you build some outdoor furniture of white oak is, oops, what happened? Come on. Oh, the battery opened up. There? Okay, I don't know what happened. Anyway, so you build your stuff out of white oak. White oak's a very weather-resistant material. You can leave it outside. It'll stand up pretty well over time, but it'll change colors. It'll probably turn gray, but it's very resistant. But you could put a finish on just outdoor furniture, whatever outdoor finish you wanted to use. And it might look better, you beautified it, but over time that finish is going to fail outside. The sun's rays are very, very powerful, and over time they'll wreck just about any finish. So you can finish that outdoor furniture, but if you do, you're kind of signing yourself up for some ongoing maintenance every couple of years. You have to touch it up or refinish it. But it's your call. Finish it or don't, but you don't have to finish everything if you don't want to. There are reasons you might or might not want to. And so I like to talk a little bit about when does the finishing process begin? And I like to say that the process begins pretty much at the conception of the piece. So you get an idea, you want to build something, and you have a picture in your head. What is this thing going to look like? And when you're completely done with that project, the likelihood of it looking the way that you envisioned to begin with is much better if you think about the finish early on in the process. So And there are a lot of considerations, a lot of things, a lot of different ways you can go. What do you want it to look like? Do you want it to look formal, casual, rustic, modern? The finish you put on can affect the sort of the emotional feel that you get of it. You know, does it feel formal? Does it feel that way, or does it feel casual? Like if you go to a restaurant and you go to like your sports bar, and they're very purposeful, intentionally want their furniture in there to be casual. They don't want it to be formal and shiny and sharp edges. They want it to have a little bit of texture, some undulations. They want it to, they don't want it shiny. And it's because the finish on that furniture affects, how people feel when they're in the room with it. So that's, think about what you're trying to achieve there. And so do you want a texture? Do you want glass smooth? Do you want it rough, something in between? Do you want to fill the pores, make it glass smooth? Or do you want to put a contrasting color in the pores to maybe add a little more interest to that board? Sheen, do you want it very shiny? Do you want it matte? Do you want it satin? Color, do you want it pale? You want rich colors, deep rich colors? You want colorful, red, blue, green? You want to paint it or dye it? So all I'm saying is, think about what you want to, where you want to go with it, and just kind of give it some thought early on in the process. And so we're talking about finishing. We all want to have a great wood finish, and so let's talk about what is a good finish. How would we define a good finish? And I think it's fairly simple in my mind. I think a good finish is very smooth. You look at it and you don't see any bumps or irregularities in the surface. You rub your hand on it, and a great finish has got a nice buttery feel to it, to me. That to me is a great finish. It just, you touch it, it just feels nice. It has a consistent sheen. If you look at it with the light reflecting off the top of it, there are no areas that are more shiny than other areas. It's very consistent, and it has a consistent color. Now, by color, I mean obviously, wood. The color in the wood, there are variations, but what I'm talking about is color that would variances in color that are there because of something you did in the finishing process. So do you have blotchy areas where you had a nice piece of cherry, and when you got done, now you have cherry with dark brown spots in it because it was a blotchy wood and we didn't dress that? Or there's other things you can do that might give you discolorations or inconsistent color in your finish. So that to me is what a good finish is. And then, the finish is appropriate for the piece, but that's pretty subjective for the most part. And so in order to get that nice, smooth, buttery finish when you're done, of course you want to do good preparation, and that's, fairly obvious. You want to sand the wood, get it smooth, no dents, scratches, oil, debris on there before you start. So you want to be, again, I talk about consistency because I think that's sort of something that goes through with finishing, that makes a good finish, is consistency throughout. And so when you're sanding your project at the end, your final sanding, you want to have a consistent scratch pattern across the boards. So think of it, if you have a small cabinet with 2 doors on the front, and you sand this one to 120, and you sand this one to 220, there's a high likelihood that those 2 doors won't match that because they have a different, deeper scratch pattern on one than the other. And certainly if you're using a stain or a dye, it will definitely be different colors. But possibly even with the regular clear finish, it might look a little darker. One might be darker than the other because you sanded them differently. So consistency again. Another thing, this is something that can sneak up on you. Say you have a flat sawn board and look on the end, and we'll just say, you know, the growth rings on the end of the board are arching upwardly, and we'll call this the top of the board. Well, did it again. What I was getting at though is the light will reflect differently on the top of the board than it will on the bottom of the board. And if how many of you have done veneering, much veneering? Okay, so those of you that have done veneering, you'll know that, or if you've even really examined or looked at veneered pieces, you have what we call book matching in veneering, where you have veneers right side up here, and the next one you flip it upside down, and then right side up and upside down. And what happens with a veneered piece like that, very, very often, if you look at it, you can see the light will reflect differently, and you can distinctly see those different pieces of veneer because the light is reflecting differently off the top and the bottom of that veneer. And the same thing can happen with solid wood. So if you orient, like on the top of this picture here, if you orient the growth rings up, down, and there's an argument for doing that. I'm not saying to never do it, but I'm just saying that if you do that, when you're done, and the light, you look at that board with the light reflecting off of it, there's a likelihood, how high I don't know, but there's a likelihood that the light will reflect differently on the boards that are oriented differently, and one might look darker, lighter. And I had that happen to me. I made a piece, and it happened to be, I don't do very much commission work, but this happened to be a commission. I glued my panel together, and I had 3 of them going one way and 1 going the other way, so I had one board that just jumped out. And so that's, you're asking how I know that. Excuse me. So that's something to think about. Okay, safety. There are a couple of pretty important safety considerations with wood finishing, and I'll go through those quickly here. One of them is personal protective equipment. You know, your eye protection, gloves, respirator. So if you're spraying, if you happen to be spraying your finish, for sure use a respirator if you're spraying. And even if you're applying your finish by hand, and even the sanding dust, you know, be careful with that stuff. The solvents that are in the wood finish that we use, they are not good inside your body. And even the water-based finishes, you know, you think, well, water-based finishes, you know, they don't have much odor, you don't smell them, they wash up with water, so that means they're probably okay to be, you know, do whatever you want with them. Not necessarily. The solvents in them can be just as bad as oil-based. You just don't, they're just not as obvious. So, you know, wear a respirator. If you can smell it, then, you know, you're getting those chemical solvents in your body, especially if you're spraying. And that's sort of obvious. I think we probably all know that. What's not quite as obvious, though, are those nitrile gloves that we wear. So we have these nitrile gloves, and they're cheap, and, you know, I know most of us will use them, or many of us will use them, and we put them on, and we think, well, you know, I got these gloves on, and it's really nice because when I'm done, I take them off, and I don't have sticky hands, and I don't have discolored hands from the stains, and I can wash up and be on my way very quickly, which is absolutely true and valid. But that is not the primary reason that you want to wear those gloves. The primary reason that you want to wear those gloves is because your skin is actually porous. Your skin is not a piece of plastic, it's actually porous. And solvents in those finishes, chemicals, they can go through your skin and directly into your bloodstream, to your brain, into your internal organs, and probably don't want that. So I always wear gloves when I'm handling finishes. The other big safety consideration with finishing is fire. Fire bad. The oil-based finishes, all of the oil-based finishes, they're all reactive. I'll talk about that later. But oily rags are the primary reason that wood shops start on fire. I mean, there are other reasons you can have a fire, but oily rags is a very, very common reason If you don't dispose of them properly, they can and they will spontaneously combust and you can start your house on fire. And so the easiest way to store them and to avoid that problem is when you're done using the rags, and I use rags a lot for finishing, more than brushes actually, but stretch that out and hang it over a wastebasket like in this picture here, or hang it over a clothesline, let it dry. What happens if you leave it balled up, that finish, that oil-based finish can react with oxygen, generate heat, and if it's balled up, the heat can't dissipate as it would when it's stretched out like this, and you can start a fire. So think about that. I used to say you could throw them in a bucket of water too, and somebody pointed out to me recently that yeah, you can put those rags in a bucket of water, but when the water goes away, the water can evaporate and potentially, this might be a stretch, but potentially the oil is still there and hasn't reacted with oxygen yet, and so it could still react after the water evaporates. So I think this is probably a little safer way to deal with it. Then of course you have your fire can. I don't know if you guys have a fire can for rags in here or not. A lot of shops do. And that will, you can dispose of them in there. But if you do dispose of them in there, it might be a good idea to maybe have a plastic bag inside of there. Because what do you do with them at the end of the day? You take that out and you put it in your dumpster. And potentially, once you take them out of that can and put them in the dumpster, they're exposed to air and they could, generate heat again. I think if they're in a plastic bag, that might be less likely. Don't park your car right next to that dumpster. So we talk about wood finishing, and this is the first thing that comes to mind. Our top coats, our clear top coats, and I say clear-ish because most of them have some color. They'll add a little, they'll darken the wood somewhat. So they're clear-ish top coats. This is a few of the many cans of stuff that I've collected over the years in my shop, and I don't even want to show you the rest of them. And there are a lot. You go to Rockler or even Menards, and there's so many things on the shelves, and there's new stuff coming out all the time. It can be overwhelming. It can be very confusing. What is all this stuff? How do I decide? And it doesn't have to be as confusing as it actually is. We can put the different finishes into categories. There are different ways that we can categorize them. One of the common ways to categorize finishes is how they cure, how they dry. There are three primary ways that finishes will cure: evaporative, reactive, or coalescing. And I'll talk about each of them. So an evaporative finish is the most simple way that a finish can dry. And when it's evaporative, there are two common finishes that are evaporative: shellac and non-catalyzed lacquer are both evaporative. What that means is you have, I'm sure a lot of you work with shellac. You buy a bag of shellac flakes. It's these crunchy little flakes. You mix them with some alcohol. The alcohol dissolves the shellac, and you have a solution then. The shellac flakes are dissolved and they're in solution in this alcohol. Then you take your brush and you brush that shellac across the work, and it dries. And what happens is the alcohol evaporates, the shellac resin dries, and when you're done, you have a nice thin, hopefully even layer of shellac on the surface of the wood. And it has not, that shellac resin has not changed chemically from when it was in the bag. It's exactly the same. The only difference is instead of being in a flake form, it's now in this very nice thin sheet across the top of the wood. So since it has not chemically changed, there's advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is that since it hasn't chemically changed, it's still susceptible to the alcohol solvent that you started with, or lacquer thinner if it were lacquer. And if you spilled your whiskey on there, you're not careful, you might damage the finish and damage that shellac. So that's a disadvantage. However, there are advantages, big advantages to this, these properties, and that would be that the same thing, that the alcohol will dissolve that. So there's a couple of things. First of all, if you have a couple of coats of shellac and you come back a month later, you put another coat of shellac on, that alcohol will melt or soften the previous layer of shellac, and it will, and when the alcohol evaporates, the resin that's remaining will actually fuse and bond to the previous layer. So you have 10 coats of shellac, and when you're done, what you end up with, you have one solid continuous layer of resin across your piece. As opposed to, I'll talk about in a minute, you don't have 10 different layers of finish sitting on top of each other. You have one continuous layer that's all fused. The good thing about that is, number one, that adhesion, you know you have perfect adhesion if they're melted and fused together. And if you want to rub out that surface with finishes that don't fuse together, you have, you know, different layers sitting on top of each other, and if you're sanding them, you can sand through one and you'll be able to sometimes see the different layers because there'll be a line, because it's separate layers together. And then of course, the other advantage to this evaporative characteristic is for repairing. You can come back later, you can put some more shellac on there, and it'll fuse in, and it's very easy to repair, and it's easy to refinish too, if you have to, and eventually you like it. So that's evaporative finishes. Then we have reactive finishes, and these are most of the other finishes that we deal with. Hardening oils, linseed oil, tongue oil, oil-based varnishes, all of these are reactive, and that's kind of what I was talking about with the rags. We'll talk about polyurethane. I'll talk about polyurethane quite a bit when I'm referring to that because it's common and we use it, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. So you have your urethane, and in the can you've got a solvent, and the urethane resin is dissolved in that solvent, and there's usually some oil in there too. Usually there's a linseed oil or a soy oil or some kind of oil mixed in with it. And what happens when you spread that across the board is the solvent evaporates, but the solvent evaporating is not chemically changing the resin. What happens though is, and it's not drying either, what happens is the resin and the hardening oils that might be in there, they react with oxygen. And in that reactive process, they chemically change, as opposed to the evaporative finishes that don't chemically change. So these reactive finishes chemically change so that once they're fully cured, they're no longer susceptible to the original solvent. So you take your polyurethane, you put a coat of polyurethane on your piece, you can come back a month later and you can wash that with mineral spirits and it won't affect it because it's chemically changed by that reactive process. So that's a difference. So advantages that it's more chemical resistant. You can spill whiskey on there and you're okay. But it's harder to repair. And like I said earlier, since each of those layers cures, and you put the next layer on, you don't have one continuous film of resin on your surface. You have multiple layers that are stacked on top of each other. So this is one of the reasons when you read the instructions, it will say to sand between coats. One of the reasons they say to sand between coats is for adhesion. Since you're not getting the chemical adhesion between the different coats of finish, then the scratches help with adhesion. You get some mechanical bonding. You know, it's bonding inside of those scratches. My experience has been that I seem to get pretty good adhesion without sanding. I don't know. Anybody have experience? You don't sand, does it tend to peel off on you? No, I haven't seen that much. Best practice is to sand between coats, but I don't know for adhesion if it's necessary all the time. But anyway, so that, go ahead, Rob, please.
So I think where the big problem comes that we're using dissimilar finishes, like putting oil varnish over polyurethane varnish or a newer finish over a really old finish.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you. So anyway, those are reactive finishes. And the third is called coalescing. And honestly, I've read about it, I read it over and over, and I don't really that well understand coalescing finishes. The way I read it and the way I understand it is a coalescing finish, and water-based, this is referring to water-based finishes. Water-based finishes are called coalescing. There's some kind of a chemical, I don't know, but it's supposed to be kind of a hybrid, curing hybrid of sort of evaporative and sort of reactive. In actual practice, I don't see much difference between this and reactive finishes, but just know that that's technically what's happening. So another way that we can categorize finishes is by whether they're oil or a film finish. And so an oil finish is just what it sounds like. It's an oil finish. It doesn't have any actual resins in it, none of the plasticky resins that you have with urethanes or other varnishes. And these oils will soak into the wood, and if it's a hardening oil, it will cure. The linseed oil, tongue oil, walnut oil, those will cure. They're hardening oils. Mineral oil would still be an oil finish, but it's not a hardening. It doesn't dry, and it will just kind of stay wet. It's perfectly acceptable. We use it on cutting boards and other things, and it's okay. It's just it is what it is. Just know what you're working with. So that's an oil finish. A film finish. Now, one thing people will say, I read about, will say, an oil finish penetrates and a film finish doesn't. I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. I take my 1 pound cut of shellac and I pour it on the board. It absolutely seems to penetrate. The difference, though, is that film finish will seal, and you can build layers up and get a film building on top of the wood. Whereas with the oil, it won't do that. The oil finishes, it's almost impossible to get it to build up on top of the wood. So the oil finishes, like I said, they will cure. They cure kind of soft, and they don't build up on the surface. They're very easy to repair because they have a low sheen, and so you don't see much difference from one spot to the next as far as if you sand it off and put more on. So they're easy to repair, they're easy to apply. They don't have very much protective. They don't protect the wood very well. They're not very water resistant. But they do add color and they make it look good, and they're typically a matte finish. If that's what you're going for, then you're in business. A couple of things I want to mention about oil finishes, though, is there's the manufacturers, they put these cans out there, they can say whatever they want. And so sometimes they'll say, here's a tongue oil finish, and it may not have any tongue oil in it whatsoever. Some of them will. Like Waterlocks, for example, is a varnish that has tongue oil in it. And so that could be considered a tongue oil finish to some extent. Usually though, when they say tongue oil, if they're talking about tongue oil, you look on the bottle, it'll say 100% pure tongue oil. So then you know you're actually dealing with tongue oil. Another one that really kind of blows my mind is teak oil. Have you ever heard of teak oil? There's no such thing as teak oil. It's a completely made up term. Teak trees don't have nuts and they don't make oil, and it's somebody just thought that was a cool thing to put on a can, and apparently it worked because they're still selling it. So just be aware that what it says on the can may not necessarily tell you much about what's in the can. And that's why I wanted to talk about the categories, because you look at those couple of 3 different categories, it really simplifies it quite a bit. Film finishes, I think I've covered this pretty well. Oil varnish blends. Now this is just what it sounds like. It's a blend. It's something in between an oil finish and a pure film finish, like a urethane. This one on the screen here, this Maloof oil, they do, or they used to sell it at Rockport. I heard they may have quit selling this, I'm not sure. But what it is it's a blend of, like I said, oil and resin. And you have what we call, if you dig into the weeds a little bit, a long oil varnish or a short oil varnish. And remember I said that your urethanes, you buy them, they've got the urethane resin in them, and they have maybe some linseed oil in them, and they have a solvent. Well, what's the proportion of oil to resin in that can? In the case of your urethane, it's mostly a urethane resin with some oil in there to help it spread around easier. I don't know exactly the why force of it, but we would call that a short oil varnish, a smaller amount of oil in proportion to the resin. Now you could have a long oil varnish. Waterlocks might be considered a long oil varnish. It's got tung oil in it, and it has some resin, not urethane, other resins. It dries like a regular varnish, but it has a higher proportion of oil in it than your polyurethane that you buy at Menards. Something to know. Okay, well, what if we push that a little further? What if we have, because even with the waterlocks, it's still a resin when it dries to a film, a hard film. But you push that a little further, and you have a small amount of resin in proportion to the oil. Now you have a long oil varnish. Lots of oil, long to a shorter amount of resin. And that's what these oil varnish blends are. So, like I said, you could, if it's still available, you could buy this Maloof oil at Menards. Nice stuff, easy to work with. There are other commercial ones. I think Tried and True has something that's comparable or similar to that. Or you could make your own. There's a common recipe out there that you'll see online if you look around for homemade oil varnish blend. The most typically you hear is a third of the drying oil, linseed tung oil, a third mineral spirits, and a third polyurethane or some other type of varnish. And this is not a hard and fast recipe. You can mix these up whichever way works best for you. You can eliminate the solvent altogether and just have half tung oil and half urethane, or you could vary the proportions. But what you're going for with this, the reason people use these is because they're so easy. They're just as easy as can be. The way you apply these is you take your rag, usually not a brush, just a rag, you rub it all over the surface of your board, you let it soak in. Some people will say to keep putting more and more on until it doesn't soak up anymore. Maybe, maybe not. But regardless, you wipe it on, and after a while you go back. If there's some excess sitting on top, you wipe that excess off completely. You wipe it dry. The reason you do that is because it's a very soft, this is a very soft finish, like an oil is a soft finish. It's kind of rubbery. So if you leave any excess puddled on the surface, the next day you'll have a rubbery, gooey spot that you're going to have to sand that stuff off. And it's a lot of extra work for nothing. So you remove all of the excess. And you repeat that process over, 3, 4, 5 coats, whatever, till it starts to look the way you want it to look. And you can get an absolute beautiful, gorgeous finish with this. It's dead simple, easy. You can build a little bit up on the surface. You can get a little bit of a sheen. You won't get a high gloss, but we usually don't, high glosses aren't really in fashion that much anyway. So you get a nice, beautiful satiny sheen, you get a little bit of protection. Not as much protection as you would with the long oil varnish, but certainly more than you would with the pure oil finish. Very popular, wonderful finish. This could be, a lot of people, this is all they'll ever use. So that would be an oil varnish blend. Hard wax oils. Now here we have hard wax oils. Hard wax oils, if you haven't heard of these, you haven't been on the internet. These are sort of the darling wood finishing world nowadays. And literally, I swear there must be a new one come out every day. Every manufacturer is on the bandwagon with their own brand of hard wax oils. The three that I have on the screen here are some of the first ones that were popularized. Odie's oil, Rubio Monocoat, and Osmo Polyox. So let me talk about these a little bit. The hard wax oils, I've experimented with these quite a bit and read up on them and watched the reviews and stuff like that, torture tests and all these things. And what I gathered from my own personal experiments is that these are really very similar to the oil varnish blends. I have samples here of these three, and I'll send these around. So this one, I didn't do these all exactly the same, but you get an idea after I explain it, I hope. So this is the Osmo Polyox. This is the one on the right side of the screen. Yep, the right side up there also. And with this particular one, I actually put 6 coats on here. And you apply these very, very similarly that you would to the oil varnish blend. The manufacturers will usually recommend that you use these non-abrasive white pads for the application. And I gave that an awful lot of thought. What's magic about these as opposed to a cotton rag? And what I finally came to realize is, remember I talked about how the oil varnish blend, if you leave any excess on the surface, it's gooey. Well, this is a great way to make sure that you don't leave anything gooey on there, and if you did, you can burnish it off in your next coat. So I personally don't believe these are necessary when you're applying this stuff. Most of the people on the internet will tell you that this is the only thing to use. I don't necessarily agree, but it doesn't mean you can't use these. These are actually kind of nice for some things. So most of these recommend 1 or 2 coats, and I think that most of them you can build, like I said, just like an oil varnish blend. They're kind of an oil varnish blend with wax in it, is what I think most of them are. Not all, and polyurethane. I've tried several different polyurethanes, and in the end, I don't see much difference between them. Minwax seems to be a little thinner, lower solids content, maybe a little easier to wipe on. Varathane is a little thicker, maybe a higher solids content. General Finishes, maybe a little higher solids content. But in the end, they're really pretty similar to each other. That's not always the case with these hard wax oils. The formulations, there's more variation, I think, from one manufacturer to the next. So anyway, this is the Polyox, and I put 6 coats on here. And I have Rubio Monocoat. It says Monocoat, you're supposed to just be able to put 1 coat. Most people who use this say you use 2 coats. And I suspect you could go up to 5 coats and get a bit of a build on there and have more sheen if you wanted to. This stuff, the Polyox, when I've used it, I did some tests where I poured a puddle of it and let it dry. And I didn't grab that bag, but I left the house today. I'm sorry, I meant to. But anyway, the Polyox will dry and cure, I should say, to a nice, flat, even surface, and it's kind of soft. The Rubio Monocoat, it kind of wrinkles up a little bit, like an oil. If you do that with an oil, the oil will wrinkle up. It doesn't smooth. But the Rubio Monocoat is actually tougher than the Osmo. The Osmo seems a little softer. And one of the things that I hear about these is, oh, they're so easy to repair. Well, of course it's easy to repair if you only put one coat on, because there's no sheen. When you're repairing a finish, the trick is trying to match the sheen and the color. Well, the color you can get pretty easily if there's just one coat, put another coat on where it's scratched. It's about the same color, and there's no sheen to begin with, so ta-da! You did it! Excuse me. So I'll pass these around, but the other one is Odie's oil. Now, like I said, most of these that I've looked at, and I've tried, I don't know, 4 or 5 different ones, and most of them are kind of an oil varnish blend in practice, I think. Odie's oil is completely different. It is not at all similar to the rest of them. Odie's oil, in my test when I took and poured a little bit in a plastic lid and let it dry cure, it never completely dried. It's been 2 years. It never completely dried. I'm serious. My guess, because they're proprietary, I don't know what's in the can, but my guess is, from what I saw, here's what I saw. I wish I remembered to bring that. But anyway, I poured a puddle of it in there, and after a long time, like 3 months, I started to get a little bit of a film on it. And I could peel that thin little film back, and there's a puddle of oil under it. And that's what it was. And 2 years later, that film was finally a little bit more substantive, but you peel it back, and there's still a tiny drop of oil under it. And so my guess is that the Odie's oil is mineral oil with a lot of wax and a little bit of some kind of a drying oil, maybe a linseed oil. I think that's what's in there. Surprisingly though, people who've done, durability tests on these and water resistant tests on these, the Odie's oil, for what it is, it actually does seem to be quite moisture resistant. Provided that you do the ongoing maintenance with it. They sell a maintenance product with that, and I think maybe with some of these others, but certainly the Odie's oil, they sell a maintenance product, and you're supposed to come by every 3 to 6 months and put some of this maintenance product on, which is, what do you suppose is in the maintenance product? Mineral oil and a little wax. And so if you like the look of it, and I have some other samples over here, if you put the Odie's oil, or these matte type finishes onto an open poured wood like this mahogany, and you sand it the way they say, which they say to sand it, that they're very weird about the sanding instructions. Don't go past 80 grit, or don't go past 150 grit or something. But if you do take the Odie's oil and you have a closed poured wood like maple or some of the exotics, then you sand it to a very high grit, 1,000 grit maybe, you get a nice sheen with it, and it'll stay shiny for quite some time. But it's a little different beast. So anyway, I'll pass these around. You can take a look at them, make what you will of it. My conclusion with these hard wax oils is they're perfectly fine, valid, finished if you want to use them. They're easy. They're not much different, I don't think, than the oil varnish blend. My understanding from the people I've met from Europe is that that's pretty much all they can buy over there. With the VOC regulations, they can't buy the same varnishes that we can here, and they're quite happy with them. They work with them, and they learn the ways to work with them and get the best from them. So that's my take on it. I think I've talked this to death. Okay, so when it comes to applying your finish, and I'm talking about film finishes here. I'm not talking too much about oil finishes, because oil finish, you can just use a rag. But with film finishes, do you want to brush it or do you want to spray it? And I have 3 different spray guns at home. I've got 2 air compressors, and I almost never use any of them. The reason, and if you're spraying a finish, spraying you can get your finish on fast. You get a nice, smooth, even, beautiful finish. Or if you screw it up, you can go south very badly, very quickly. But really, if you have practice and you're familiar with the products you're using, spray finishing is terrific. I don't do it much though because I don't have the facilities for it. I don't have a spray booth. So when I do want to spray something, something that I think is worth the trouble of spraying, I have to drag my compressor over by the window, hang the hose out the window, go out in the backyard and hope it's not windy, and hope it's not too sunny, and hope it's not raining, and all the stars align and I can spray it. So I don't spray very often, but I don't want to say it's a bad thing, but certainly not. I apply most of my finishes by hand, and I can get, you look at my samples over here, all of those samples are applied by hand. I can get a really beautiful finish by hand. Yes, it's more time consuming, but you can do it, and it's not that difficult. So I apply by hand, and when I look at these, so I have this next slide here, brushes, and let's not call these brushes, let's call these applicators, because an applicator, that really encompasses more of what we can use. You don't have to always use a brush. I have on the screen these paint pads, these foam paint pads with the little white fuzzy stuff on them. Those are actually pretty good. You can really apply a lot of finish in a short time with them. These white squares, one of them is one of these, and one of them is, do I have it one with me or not? No. But they have these, you go to Woodcraft or Harbor Freight even, and you can buy, it's a sponge with a terry cloth sewn around the sponge. And those actually work pretty good. The ones at Woodcraft look a little nicer than the ones at Harbor Freight, and they're a lot more expensive too. So, but those work good for oil finishes, all oil-based finishes. The foam, the little foam brushes like this, these work pretty good. Oh, I've got a list here. These work pretty good for, you can use these with waterborne. Waterborne finishes are pretty forgiving with the type of applicator, or brush I should say. I don't use a rag with waterborne. These little foam brushes, you can get a nice finish with these. The problem with these is they don't hold much finish. They just hold just a tiny amount. If you talk to a professional painter, I'm sure somewhere in the room there's someone who's been in construction and you know some painters, and you ask them what they look for in a brush, and they'll almost always tell you they want a brush that holds a lot of paint, because they don't want to be dipping back in that can every couple of minutes. They want to, flow it out and get a nice wet edge and keep going and not have to keep going back to the can. These don't hold very much, but they do a good job. For oil-based finishes, classic recommendation is a natural bristle brush like this, and it's a little stiffer than some of the nylon brushes, and this is the go-to brush for oil-based finishes. I normally use rags though, because most of my projects are smaller, and I have really good luck using rags. Let me see. Water-based finishes, you can use a nylon brush, or like I said, foam. These are a nylon, they call them Taclon brushes. You can buy these little duties at Menards, pretty cheap. These work good for shellac. They work okay for water-based finishes. I wouldn't use these as an oil-based finish. They're too light. They don't hold much. But for shellac or water-based, they're okay. For waterborne finishes, though, I discovered this brush, and I'll pass this around. I got this brush at Tools for Working Wood. I think it's a Gramercy brush. It doesn't say on it, but I think it's a Gramercy. And this is developed for water-based finishes. And this, it's expensive. I mean, this little brush is probably $50, $60. But it is so much nicer than any other brush for water-based finishes. It really makes a difference. If you're going to be doing much work with water-based finishes, I think it's worth it. So take a look at this brush. It holds a lot of finish. It flows it out nicely. I like it a lot. So let's see. Oh, and since I do use the rags quite a bit, the bane of wood finishing is lint and dust. That is the enemy of your wood finisher. That little tiny hairs, I don't know where they come from. And so when I have a rag and I'm going to use that to apply my finish, after I fold it up nice and neatly and I get all the loose edges on the inside, it's a nice flat bottom on after I get it shaped, I take a piece of masking tape, I flip it upside down, and I tap it all around any surfaces and get any lint off. And you almost always pull some lint off. So that's worth the trouble. And so to talk about applying your finish. So if I were finishing this bench top here, and we'll just say I'm using a polyurethane because it's a workbench and that's good enough and it's tough. Take my little brush, put it in a can, and go deep, 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 deep. Put it in a can, and deep, 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 deep. And after a while, I'm over here. By the time I get over here, this part is already dry. You don't want that. What you want when you're applying a finish, especially an oil-based finish, is you want to get that stuff on. Boom, 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 as fast as you can, and then go over it, smooth it out. Some people like to they'll tip it off, they'll go across with the brush like this, or you can take the rag and go back and smooth it out, even it out. But you want the entire surface wet when you do that. You don't want this part to be dry and that part to be wet because you just get a mess. So the point though that I'm getting at is you want to size the applicator to the size of the project. So I'll go back here. This big paint pad here would be great for something, a large tabletop. That thing will hold a ton of finish, and you could cover the whole surface in 60 seconds or a minute and a half, something like that. Or something similar would be good. Or a big brush. So keep that in mind. You want to get this stuff on there and get it on quickly so you can smooth it out and stand back. Let it do its thing. So finish the finish. Well, before I even get to that, I want to point something out in this picture here. I don't want to forget to mention this. You see in this picture on the side there, I have that little portable lamp. And so I'll get ahead of myself just a tad here. People ask me, well, what's the best finish? And I'll say, well, let me ask you something. Which is better, a dovetail or a Morrison tenon? Well, it depends. And the best finish you use depends, right? There are so many products out there and so many ways to do it. If you find that some process that works well and works for you, that's the best finish for you. You don't have to be rigid about following somebody else's process. There are some tried and true things out there that you can follow, and you'll probably have good luck. But if you vary on that a little bit and it works for you, that's fine. So I don't think there are some rules, and there's a lot of variability. But if you are sanding your wood and you're putting your finish on, and you don't have a light off to the side to see what you're doing it wrong. Sorry, I'm trying to be funny here, but it's really not. Seriously, no. And I'm just joking around a little bit there. But seriously, you always want to have a light, what they call a raking light, coming off the side when you're applying your finish and when you're sanding. If you're in a room, well, this light isn't too bad, but generally the light, I know in my workshop, is a nice even LED light, and it's a nice flat light that comes down, and I can't see any details with that light. It's too flat, and there's no contrast. I can't see the sanding scratches. But if I take a little lamp like that, and I put it on the side, and it's going across at an angle, I can see all the sanding scratches perfectly. It really, really makes a big difference. Off of my soapbox. So we have what we call finish the finish. And when you get done with your finish, even if you spray it, most often, unless you're really, really, really good, most often you, like I said earlier, you want that nice buttery feel when you rub your hand across it. And most often when you're done, you don't have quite that buttery feel. You've got couple little dustings in there, maybe some air bubble things or something. And you want to address that. You don't want to put that out and say, here, I'm done, because really you want to finish that finish. You're not finished. So there are some ways to address that. And what I have found that I really like using is very, very fine sandpaper, a 3,000 or a 5,000 grit sandpaper. And it just barely touch, almost just the weight of the paper itself go across when I'm done. And it'll just cut those little dust nibs right off, and I can get that buttery smooth surface. And the sandpaper is so fine, I put it on there so lightly that unless I have a very high gloss, shiny finish, chances are you will never be able to see any scratches from that paper. Another trick to when you're doing that is you put your varnish on at night and you get up in the morning. Don't do it then. It takes these things. They'll be dry, like I said earlier. That the solvent will evaporate and the curing process will begin. But that finish is not fully cured, maybe for a month even. It takes a long time for it to fully cure. So give it a couple of days, give it a week, give it 2 weeks if you can. Then come back with that very fine sandpaper and just touch it. Another thing you can do that, if you don't want to use sandpaper, these non-abrasive white pads, those will, you can use those, and instead of using sandpaper to cut those little nibs off, you can take something like this and you can burnish those nibs in. And it's same effect, basically. Some people will use paper. They'll take a brown paper bag and they'll fold it up and they'll just rub that paper across the surface to burnish those nubs in. Or a piece of cardboard, a nice smooth piece of cardboard, roll it up so that you don't have any sharp edges, and you can burnish that surface down. And then finally, I put wax on almost everything that I make. When I'm done, the final thing I do, I put some wax on there. Then you really got that nice buttery surface on there. Let me see. Where am I at? Oh, sheen. Let's talk about sheen for a minute. So sheen is a measure of how much light reflects off the surface of the wood. And we have, terms for that. We have flat, matte, satin, semi-gloss, very glossy. And we all kind of know what these mean. And for the most part, that is good enough. You don't really need anything beyond that. But you should know, and these are subjective terms. But you should just to be aware, you can objectively measure that too. And being that I got to be, thanks Raleigh, I got to be a nerd with some of this finishing stuff, and I was kind of already there. I went out and I bought this little gloss reader. Very expensive, relatively speaking. Do not spend the money and buy one of these, it's not worth it. But if you go on the manufacturer's website, most of them, and you look at, they have their gloss, semi-gloss satin, they will have a numerical value for how shiny that is. So it'll say, this semi-gloss has a gloss level of 76, and this gloss has a gloss level of 87, and this matte has a gloss level of 32. And so there, you can take a little machine like this and you can actually measure the sheen on the surface for what it's worth, not much. But what is important to know is how most of your film finishes, the natural state for your film finishes is glossy. Polyurethane, shellac, lacquer, these things, their natural state is glossy, and they have to, the manufacturers have to modify them somehow to make them not glossy. So if you buy a glossy can of varnish, it's just that. It's all varnish in there, and you put it on, and it's glossy to some extent. And if you buy that same manufacturer, same stuff, and it's semi-gloss, they'll do is they'll add flattening agents into the product. And the flattening agents, I think it's ground silica powder. It's a very fine powder that they put in there. And that's the stuff at the bottom of the can that you have to stir up. So you stir the can, and that powder that's been added to it, it comes up into suspension, and when you put it on, those flattening agents will, diffract the light when it hits the surface, and it'll look less shiny. And so that's the most common way that that's achieved. And there's a school of thought that let me back up. That sheen is really only on the very, very surface of the finish. The previous coats, if you have 4 coats, the first and second coat are not affecting the sheen regardless of what came out of the can, because the light is only reflecting at the very, very surface of the finish. So there's a school of thought that says if you're going to put 4 coats of finish on, I'm kind of messing my microphone up, you're going to put 4 coats of finish on, that you should put 3 coats of gloss and then have your final coat be the semi-gloss or the satin, whatever it is. And the reasoning for that is that if you have your satin finish, 4 or 5 coats of satin finish, that you're obscuring the finish. There's not as much clarity, and that's, in theory, that's true. In practice, it's not worth it. Unless you got a museum piece, or if you're using some finish that's really matte, you could possibly obscure the finish, but I don't think it's worth the trouble to bother with the different things. But understand that there's a school of thought out there for that. The other way that you can affect the sheen is with scratches. You can purposely scratch the surface, and the scratches will affect how the light reflects off it and vary the sheen. And we call that rubbing it out. So, can I get louder here? Anyway, so you can add scratches on there, and it's really a great way to do it if you do it right and it's not difficult. One common way that this is used is with shellac. Shellac, again, naturally very shiny, and so people will brush shellac on. When they're done, they say, okay, that looks like I have enough shellac in there, I like it, and they'll come back and they'll use very fine sandpaper or steel wool, and you can, some people will orient the steel wool so the fibers of the steel wool are in line with the strokes, and use a lubricant. A lubricant, maybe you use wax or water with some dish soap in it as a lubricant, or you can buy something called wool lube, and that's kind of a real thick water with dish soap in it. And anyway, you go ahead and you rub the surface across there, and what you're doing is you're removing a lot of those surface imperfections, those irregularities, and you're adding these uniform scratches, and you're bringing it down to more of a satiny look, and it's gorgeous. It's a very, very good way to go. So those, and you can also, let me know, you can not only bring the sheen down by doing that, you can bring the sheen up, like they do with cars. You know, they have those polishing machines and very, very fine abrasive, and they can bring them up to a super high gloss. So you can affect the sheen by that. It's a lot easier just to buy a can of satin foam, but it's a way to go. Put that in your toolbox. So get back to the big question here. So what finish do you want to use? What should I use? And I'll go back to the beginning. What was your criteria? What were you trying to achieve to begin with? You know, did you want it shiny, matte, formal, casual? And think about the requirements for the piece. A mantle clock does not need a finish that's the same durability as a dining room table. So, you know, you can do mantle clock, you can use almost anything, and it's going to be plenty durable enough because nobody ever touches it. It just sits up there and you dust it once in a while. Dining room table, you got kids, grandkids, you want something durable. So that's a consideration. And there are other considerations. Think about your workspace. Like I said, for spraying, if I had the perfect ideal workspace, I would probably spray most of the time, but I don't. And so I found another way that works just as well, or as it works well enough for me. And so a lot of people here, maybe you guys have nice big pole barns, something like this. You can go have a spray booth in the corner. The smell isn't a problem. You're not bothering anyone. It's not a big consideration. Or maybe you live in a condo and you're using a spare bedroom for your woodworking, and you know, spraying is out of the question. Maybe even oil-based finishes might be out of the question. You don't want that. Maybe you don't want that solvent spray going down the hall and bothering your neighbors. So your workspace might affect your choice. And then another thing is, how much time do you want to spend? You can spend a lot of time messing around with the finish, and I do it all the time. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, necessarily, but it's certainly a consideration. How much time do you want to spend? You can get, like I said, this oil varnish blend, the hard wax oils, wipe them on, do a few coats, put some wax on top, and it looks great, you're done. If that's durable enough, and you get the look that you want, it's easy, wow, Bob's your uncle, you're in business. But if you want a super high gloss finish, a piano-like finish where the pores are filled and it's smooth and it's glassy and it's glossy, that's much, much, much more time consuming. Much less forgiving than some of these other finishes. So your selection, again, dovetail, Morrison Tennant. It's subjective. You make your choice, and you're probably going to be okay. And that's what I've got. Yes, sir.
Question: when you went with the evaporative finishes, you talked a lot about the shellac.
Yeah.
Kind of quit talking about lacquer. Do you compare them? They're very similar in the way you apply them. And
No.
About drying time.
No, they're really not that similar in how you would apply them. You can spray shellac, but most people will brush it or use a pad to apply shellac. Lacquer dries even faster than shellac, and it's really, there are brushing lacquers out there. They're not very common. Typically, lacquer, you have to spray it because it just dries so fast.
What about the set time then? You're talking, several days to let things harden? Lacquer would be less time?
Well, I don't know. I guess it would depend on the particular product. I mean, maybe somebody else has got better ideas on cure times.
Lacquer cures pretty fast.
Yeah.
you can speed it up a little bit by using some acetone
Mm-hmm.
as thinner. And usually you can get white swarf off of black earth in a few hours.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I have, like I said, I don't spray much, I haven't sprayed, I have used lacquer some, not that much. Raleigh probably with a lot more than I have. Yes, sir?
What is the finish that you're seeing that they wipe on and then they're hardening it with the UV lights?
Ah, I know a little bit about that. These UV finishes are out there. I've used the UV cured grain fillers, and for grain filling, it's really pretty good. They work quite well. You put it on, you remove the excess with a squeegee. You either hit it with the UV light or you take it out in the sun for a few minutes, and it'll cure very quickly. It doesn't shrink because supposedly there's no solvent in it. Supposedly the UV finishes are 100% solids content, which I don't understand, but that's what they say. So they work. I've actually looked into that a fair amount, and there's there are several manufacturers making these UV cured finishes. The one that I've looked at is called Solarez, and they have a dozen different products, if not more. And it appears that they can make this UV cured. They can make almost any resin into a UV cured finish. They have epoxies that are UV cured. They have polyesters that are UV cured. They have lacquers that are UV cured. They have urethanes that are UV cured. So apparently they can do their magic and make almost anything UV cured. I don't know about, I have worked with the grain fillers quite a bit and messed around with them and know quite a bit about how the grain fillers work. I've never used one for a top coat, and I don't know how that would work. I think it would be a whole completely new, different learning curve to use them for a top coat. I don't know if they have to be sprayed. I don't know if you can apply them by hand. I don't know if there's some tricks. If you're interested in doing that, I would say do some research, maybe call the manufacturer and ask them about it, because they're completely different. From what I have seen using the grain fillers, if the top coats are similar, I think it'd be very hard to get a fin in the wood finish, because I think it might lay on the surface, kind of like if you're using an epoxy. I mean, it's not the same, but if you imagine, I think it'd be similar as far as the final result to an epoxy, in that it's hard to get a fin in the wood finish that looks like an oil or a natural finish. I suspect that unless you're able to spray it or some other application process, that you would probably end up with something that's a thicker finish, a thicker film, and you'd probably have to smooth it out and sand it down to get it looking the way you want. But I honestly don't know that. It's a good question though. Anything else? All right. Well, thanks for having me out here. Appreciate it.